Okay, we're rolling now. Barry, when you arrived in Canada, you didn't exactly have a small fortune. Tell me about the means you had, financial means and otherwise.
Well, in those dim, dark days, we're talking about 1951 now, surprise, surprise, the UK was having an economic crisis. When is it not? And so a regulation was made that anybody who was making a visit to a dollar country might only take with them, no matter what the size of their family, £50. In then exchange terms, that would have been, well, generously less than $200. So that although I was coming to Canada with these two beautiful babies of ours, my beautiful wife, to visit all these in-laws whom I'd not seen, in many cases ever, or in other cases not for a long time, I realized that unless I was going to do something to get some more funds from somewhere, I was going to be living not only probably with, but on my in-laws. And so I had to dredge up some way of producing more revenues. So I went to various friends of mine at the BBC. In those days I used to do a great deal of work for the BBC, both on radio and on television. And the director of drama at the BBC at that time was the brother of the great actor John Gielgud. His name was Val Gielgud. And I had done a great deal of work for him. And I said to him, look, Val, I'm aiming to pay a visit to Canada with my wife and our two babies. And I need to find out how I can possibly produce some more money whilst I'm there, because I'm only going to be allowed to take £50. And he said, well, CBC in Canada, which is kind of the opposite number to us here, has a very good radio service, and I've no doubt they'd be delighted to see you and perhaps give you some things to do which would produce some more revenue. So he very kindly introduced me to his opposite numbers in Canada, Rupert Kaplan in Montreal, I remember, and Andrew Allen in Toronto. And in no time at all, I was doing all kinds of things on CBC Radio, which took us through the summer. And by that time, we had fallen so much in love with Canada that we wanted nothing so much as to stay here. I always say that I'm that rare breed of Canadian who was British by the accident of birth, but became Canadian by the exercise of choice. And we're very proud of that. I always remember that after we'd been here a little while, and we'd made the decision that we would stay, because by that time we had heard that television was about to burst upon an astonished Canada. I remember ringing up whatever department it was of naturalization or immigration, and how different it was in those days. I rang up and I talked to a young woman, and I explained that my wife and I and our children had come from London, England, and had been in Canada for however long it was at that point, and I began to foresee that there might be very solemn rituals attached to this process of becoming a Canadian, involving Bibles and blood and who knows what. And so I said to the young woman, please tell me, what do I have to do in order to get myself and my wife and our two youngsters made Canadians? She said, oh, you just have to come to 398 Bay Street and it's $10 cash. That's what it was in those days. But the result was, it was the best day's work I've ever done in my life, of course. And the result was that in the fullness of time, television was about to begin here in Toronto, where we are now. And I suddenly realized, or various people reminded me, that I was probably the only person in Canada who'd ever faced one of these things, a television camera, in anger, as it were. And various people, including my dear old friend Maeva Moore, who was, as it were, in charge of production for CBC's first television service, reinforced my decision to stay here where I was. But of course, in those days, the whole of the dramatic personnel of Canada, if you like to call it that, those people who acted in plays or directed plays or wrote plays, or indeed anything other kind of dramatic entertainment, the total personnel of the dramatis personae, if you like, of Canada, could be put into a relatively small school bus, because there were all these famous names, famous two Canadians in those days, all too many of them, alas, no longer with us, and far too many of them forgotten. People like John Draney, Tommy Tweed, Bud Knapp, Alan King, Lorne Green, all sorts of, I mustn't forget the ladies, Ruth Springford, Alice Hill, Peggy Brown, Jane Mallet, of course. All of those people were the nucleus of what was, in effect, almost you might say, the National Theatre of Canada, because they all lived here in Toronto. They all of them regarded the CBC's headquarters on Jarvis Street as their Mecca. And week after week, we all played together in something or other virtually every day. In fact, our group of, 18 or 20 actors and actresses was so tight-knit and so firmly established that if ever an actor turned up whom we hadn't actually seen before, we tended to look round at him in the studio as if he'd just dropped from Mars. Young people who were just beginning to emerge in our profession at that time, like Christopher Plummer and William Shatner and Lloyd Buckner, a younger chap, Don Harron, although of course he was already pretty firmly established in the theatre. All of those people were part of what was in effect almost a repertory company in the terms that it would be used in the theatre in other countries. Because week after week we would play in all sorts of different things. Our day would usually begin, it's extraordinary to think of now, our day would usually begin at about 6:30 in the morning, when we would find our way down to the CBC's headquarters on Jarvis Street in order to rehearse and then play live some dramatic presentation or perhaps some history or geography program for the CBC's schools broadcasts. And of course, you must understand that all the shows were live, and so they had to start to be rehearsed at 6:30 in the morning in order that they might go out on the air at 9 or 9:30 to all the schools across Canada. And of course, at that time of day, many of us were not all that wide awake and didn't always have our, as we say nowadays, our act together. And so there were many hysterical, giggly kinds of productions that went out on the air. I hope the poor children who received them were no worse for it. But we developed all kinds of little short cuts, because in those days also, most of the sound effects and crowd effects would be made by us. If there was a revolution brewing, we would all make warlike sounds in the background whilst poor old John Draney was trying to read some narration about in the War of 1812, get him out of here, all that stuff would be going on in the background. Or if there were a case, as there sometimes was, of an Indian band, let's say, plotting some kind of insurrection, we discovered that a very good sound effect of revolting Indians could be made if we all stood in a group and said loblaws over and over again, one after the other. Loblaws, 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 loblaws. And that would come out sounding like, as we thought, rebellious Indians. So out of that group grew a kind of dramatic tradition, which I think few people in our country have recognized was really the nucleus of the immense flowering that there has been of the theatre in general in our country for, the last 45 years. Because at the time when I was fortunate enough to stumble, as it were, most of the best things in one's life are determined by flukes, aren't they? At the time when I was lucky enough to stumble into the dramatic personnel of this country, most of the so-called theatre in this country, that is to say, the ordinary theatres situated as they were in most of the big cities, had their dramatic material provided for them by companies which came either from the UK or from the US. I can remember that there was a critic somewhere about the time of the First World War who, in a rather faintly complaining way, said that Canada is the only country on earth whose theatre is entirely controlled by aliens. Now, he didn't mean them up there. He meant companies coming, as they did, mostly from the US and the UK. Because almost all of the theatres, places like the old Her Majesty's in Montreal, or the Royal Alexandra here in Toronto, were supplied with productions which usually originated either in New York or in London. The other smaller theatres, sometimes rather contemptuously called little theatres, because they were that, they were usually little in size, were supplied by productions produced by local amateur dramatic societies. But out of the ranks of those good people came, of course, the very nucleus of that brave band of actors who eventually did provide the country with such companies as the Shakespeare Festival at Stratford, Ontario, the Neptune Theatre in Halifax, all the other theatres right across the country. But all of that, really, virtually all of it, has come into being in a professional sense within the last, put it no stronger, within the last 45 years. An extraordinary record, really. Because
Barry, were you not warned that there was...
Can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah. Going to be warm.
I have ears like a bat. Thank God.
Closing again?
No.
Okay.
Rolling.
All right, Barry, I wanted to ask you, Toronto had a reputation for being cliquish and closed. Did you find this to be true?
No. Do you know, it's a great compliment to all those colleagues of mine of years ago, and I suppose it may be implicitly a bit of a compliment to me, that although I came from over there, and although I'd learned that there had been other examples of actors coming from the UK who tended to give themselves airs a bit because they happened to have had a bit of experience perhaps in London's West End or something like that, I found that quite universally all that band of actors and writers and directors who were assembled here, as I say, a relatively small group, no more than certainly 30 or 40 of them at most, were very open-minded and open-hearted and open-armed, really. And I very soon had loving friendships with many, many of them, some of which have lasted to this day, others of which, of course, have only been broken by the fact that those dear people, many of them, are no longer with us. But I think there was already in the air, in the late 40s and early 50s, an awareness that something very exciting was brewing here in Canada, that there was about to be, as indeed there was, an immense explosion of activity. And those people who were at this point of confined to working only in radio, very soon most of them moved over into television and began to discover all kinds of new skills. That was one of the advantages that Canada had, you know. To go back a great deal further, I started to work in this lunatic trade of ours, of pulling faces and making noises for a living, as I call it. I started in the mid-1930s, so we're talking about, well, almost 60 years ago. And at that time, when theatre first started to meld in England into television, television was regarded with great suspicion by most people in our profession, partly because it was immensely expensive. I must explain that because of the rarity of the actual mechanism itself, the cost of an average small television set, and of course you will know that the average television screen was about yay big. It was about the size of a small boat porthole. And indeed, unless you had your nose almost entirely pressed to it, you couldn't tell whether you were looking at a battleship or a beautiful girl, because it was covered with blizzards of snow. But nonetheless, it was immensely expensive, with the result, of course, that if you are considering, I suppose, in purchasing power in today's terms, a small television set would cost probably the equivalent of some $25,000. It meant necessarily that only very wealthy people could have them. And also, of course, there was the restriction that the area of reception was very limited, and only if you lived more or less centrally in London could you get any kind of a picture at all. because the transmitter, which stood slightly to the north of London in a place called Alexandra Palace, named after that Queen Alexandra, had a range of only some 3 or 4 miles. And so no matter how much money you had, you couldn't conceivably receive a television picture unless you lived within that area. Well, that resulted, of course, in there being very few sets, but it also resulted in our profession, the theatrical profession, having a very lofty and rather contemptuous view of this new medium. I, of course, being then a youngster, as I say, I started in this trade about 60 years ago, I was anxious to get my feet wet, as were many other youngsters, in this new medium, just as we had been a few years before, others of us, to get our feet wet in the new medium of radio. But it was all conducted from this one city, London, and therefore those people who were active and prominent in the theatre had a very high-profile view of television. It was down there somewhere. And I can remember, at the time when I was working in one of my earliest television performances, somewhere about 1936, I was also working in a stage play. And the leading man of this play was a very eminent, well-known actor, and he said to me, forbiddingly one day, "What is this you're doing during the day, Morse?" And I said, "Oh, it's for BBC, sir." "Ah, yes, he said. "It's the wireless, isn't it?" The wireless was what we always called radio, you see. I said, "Well, no, sir, it isn't the wireless, actually. No, sir. It's like the wireless, but with pictures." "Oh, yes," he said with infinite contempt. "You are a fool, wasting your time on that sort of twaddle." He said, "Don't you realise? It's just a fad, like the yo-yo. They'll have forgotten all about it by Christmas." And that's what many people believed, that it was simply a rich man's fad that would pass and be forgotten. And so, of course, the number of audiences that one had for a television play were very limited. And all productions of television dramas would be played for 2 performances. One on a weekday evening, I can't remember which weekday, it may have been Thursday or something like that, and another performance of the same play, because they were all live, of course, on Sunday afternoon, for those people who either weren't at home when it was shown the first time, or perhaps couldn't believe it when they saw it the first time. But it meant that television was a poor relation of the theatre. Now, a very different process occurred in the US of A. There, television was perceived as a poor relation not only of the theatre, but also a poor relation of the movies. And the movie industry was paranoid with terror at the incursion of this new medium when it started to take hold in the early 1950s, because they could foresee that it was going to bang a considerable hole into the economics and the revenues of the cinema world. And so it was regarded as a poor relation and very much discouraged in the US of A. If an actor was known to be a television actor, he would tend not to be employed in the movies. If an actor was known to be a theatre actor, he was kind of out of touch with television because it was, again, viewed from a considerable height with great contempt. Now, here's the crunch, I think, that here in this dear land of ours, in Canada, television had the opportunity, I have to use the past tense because I'm afraid it no longer is really operable, it had the opportunity to spring into life out of whole cloth, as we say, because it wasn't traditionally a descendant of the theatre, it wasn't a poor relation of the movies, it grew out of anything, if out of anything, out of the radio, which was produced by the dear CBC. And so the result was that people who were mixed up in these early days of television, and you'll hear from others of them, I'm sure, will tell you that there was such an air of excitement and freshness about this new medium that we were entering here in Canada, that the improbable was done all the time, and the impossible quite often, because we didn't know any better. You will remember that the great Tyrone Guthrie, when he came to Canada to found our Stratford Shakespeare Festival, gave as one of his reasons reasons why he had agreed to come to Stratford, Ontario, which had no theatrical connections at all. Nothing remotely, except this bright young man called Tom Patterson, who had a dream that there might be a Shakespeare festival in his town. But the great Tyrone Guthrie gave us one of his reasons for wanting to come to Stratford, that it had no theatrical traditions, no theatrical conventions, and that therefore he could do this impossible thing. He could bring to life this impossible dream because we, the Stratfordians, the Ontarians, didn't know that it wasn't possible. If you'd started to do such a thing in London, people would have appeared out of the woodwork, ready and willing to prove to you that it's totally impossible. If you tried to do such a thing in New York, all kinds of experts would have leapt from the skies to assure you that it was a total impossibility. But we didn't know any better. The curious thing about our profession is that everybody, in a sense, has two professions, their own and ours. The kind of fella who would never dream of trying to tell his dentist how to fill teeth, or trying to tell a guy who's got a hole dug in the road how he should fill it up. Those very same people are immediate, infallible, omniscient experts in our trade. They all know precisely what's going to succeed, what's going to fail, what's good, what's bad. It's an astonishing thing. Please do.
But Guthrie had already worked in Canada, right?
Yes, he did.
And he knew he wanted to avoid cultural
I'm glad you thought of that, J.D., because Tyrone Guthrie, who I think most people of my generation would regard as one of the great theatrical figures of our lifetime, had a particular fondness for Canada because he'd been here before. Not a lot of Canadians know that. He had been invited by the Canadian National Railway and the then infant CBC to do a series of radio shows about the history of Canada, in particular the history as related to the transportation system. And he came in the early 1930s, I better not guess the year, but it would have been something like 33 or 34. He came and spent quite a long time here in Canada, mostly in Montreal, producing this series of radio shows, of which he was a great expert. And it was that which inflamed him with the idea that this Canada of ours would be a magically apt place in order to found this Shakespearean theatre. So when Tom Patterson bravely went to his local town council in Stratford, as he'd been doing for a number of occasions, badgering them to give him some money to do something about Shakespeare, when they finally, almost out of weariness, gave him a few $100s, he went and spent it all on a ticket to London and went to see Tyrone Guthrie and said, Dr. Guthrie, I'm from Stratford, Ontario, in Canada, and where we live, because our town is called Stratford, we'd rather like to do something about Shakespeare. Do you think you could come and help us? Guthrie at once, to his astonishment, said, yes, when would you like me to come? And came. And within a short span of time, you can read all about it in the many books that have been written about the founding of Stratford, within a short span of time, he persuaded all sorts of eminent people, led by Alec Guinness, who was then about the most marketable film star on earth, to come and play in a Shakespeare season in Stratford, Ontario. People thought the world had been turned upside down, that he was defying the laws of gravity. But, like so many other impossible dreams, it worked. And perhaps we can be proudest of the fact that Guthrie saw that with the speculation and enthusiasm which could be whipped up here in Canada, he could do something here which he probably wouldn't have been able to do anywhere else in the so-called theatrical world. Miraculous.
And the daughter of John Draney, Bronwyn Draney, wrote a book on the stage and said that the Toronto regulars were a little bit worried when the British wave came over. Oh, to be in England now that England's here is a famous quote.
That's right. I was perhaps lucky to be among the first wave, as it were, of actors and other artists of different kinds who came to Canada. But because I'd had a good deal of experience in the UK and knew a great many people in our profession in the UK, you know how these absurd reputations are gained. It soon began to be believed among certain performers in the UK that in some way or other I owned the whole of the performing arts trade in Canada. And my house at one time, I remember, was known as the British Embassy, because there was a long stream of actors and directors and what have you who would turn up and seek to make their mark here. Well, some of them did and some of them didn't. One young fellow who I remember stayed with us when he first came here was Patrick Macnee, who later became famous in The Avengers. And there were various other actors, some of whom had better be nameless, because I always used to say to my wife, do you know, I could stand at the airport or at the docks if they were coming by sea, as many people did in those days, and I could infallibly tell which one of them should come and which one shouldn't bother. Because there was an instinct among some of our colleagues to arrive with an immensely patronizing air. They were bringing, as Tony Guthrie said about that first Shakespeare festival season, we must not let it appear to be, he said, a cultural mission to the colonies. But there were many of my colleagues from the UK who arrived with that rather superior, supercilious air, as if they were bringing some culture to the backward colonies. And they, of course, all failed. They didn't stay long, got fed up, announced that there were better worlds elsewhere, and went away. But there were others who did persist and adjust themselves in the way that one always has to do when one's moving into a new environment. And it was that quotation which has become quite famous. I actually heard said by, unfortunately, the late Jerry Saraceni, a Canadian-born actor, who said one day, yes, at one of these productions which was packed with newly arrived UK actors and so forth, he said, "Oh, to be in England, now that England's here."
I'd like to quickly ask you a little bit about the Mountain Theatre. Your first experiences in Montreal, the Montreal stage,
yes.
long now. Can you describe the setup?
In those dear, dim, distant days, there was a lovely, lovely theatre in Montreal, right on the top of the mountain. It had previously been the headquarters of the Park, Toboggan and Ski Club, and there was a little kind of ski run that went down there. There was a toboggan route that people could follow. But in the summer, it had begun to be used occasionally as a theatre venue, because it was a timber building, quite charming in a kind of fake Swiss chalet kind of style. And it could accommodate, I seem to remember, something on the short side of 300 seats if it were really closely packed, which thank God it usually was. And when I first came, as I was telling you, eager to do anything that might produce revenue, the lady who was then running the Montreal Mountain Playhouse asked me about doing a play of Noel Coward's, a play called Present Laughter, which I happened to have played in London and knew quite well. And my wife had also played in it with me in London. She knew it quite well. And so we said, well, yes, why not? We'll do this play on the mountain. And Noel Coward, who was, by way of being a friend of our families, because he had, way back during the war, asked me to play a part in a famous film of his called In Which We Serve, which is all about the Royal Navy. And I was to play the navigating officer. But in the course of the film, the ship in which all these officers were serving was sunk, and they all had to spend some time, as it were, bobbing about in the sea, most of which was shot, of course, in a tank. But nonetheless, it meant that numbers of days had to be spent by all these actors in the water. Now, as bad luck would have it, I had had TB as a youngster, just after Sydney. My dear wife and I were married in 1939. They discovered that I had TB. And so the result was that I couldn't play this part in this film because the insurance people would not offer coverage for me if I was going to spend a number of days in this freezing cold water. And so that was a staggering disappointment to me as a young fellow. And Noel Coward was very sympathetic, as he always was, to actors. And he constantly, after that, offered me all sorts of other kinds of opportunities in the theatre and so forth. So when we were in Montreal, and we were about to do the production of his play, Present Laughter, I conceived the idea that it would be a very good publicity stunt if we could arrange to have a telephone conversation with Noel Coward and have the CBC record it. And so we did. We arranged with Noel for a certain time of day on a certain day of the week to ring him up, and we would talk about this upcoming production of his play, Present Laughter. And the CBC recorded it, played it on the air. Well, of course, it attracted immense amount of attention. Noel Coward saying, "Hello, Barry, how are you, my dear? Oh, you're in the colonies, are you? Yes. Is it snowing there? No, I suppose not." And I can't do Noel Coward, but you can imagine the kind of conversation that he did. And the result was that, I hope it had something to do with the quality of our production as well, the result was that we were packed to the doors. And we ran that production of Coward's Present Laughter for what was then the record long run of any play in the whole history of the theatre in Canada. Shows you what a difference a day makes, what a difference a decade makes, where we now have productions in Canada which run 4 or 5 years. But in those days, 6 or 8 weeks was the record. And so that was a means of establishing ourselves in the theatre, at least, in Canada. And we did another season there, my wife and I, in which we did another play of Coward's, Private Lives. And we were joined there by 2 lovely, lovely actors who are still great friends, Jack Creeley and Corinne Connolly, both of whom, of course, went on to all sorts of distinction in other theatres in Canada. And it was a very fortunate beginning.
Plummer and Shatner.
Christopher Plummer and William Shatner. You know whom I'm referring to, of course, I'm sure, don't you? Christopher came from Montreal, and so did Billy, as I persist in calling him, because I first knew him when he was a young fellow newly out of college. Chris and Bill Shatner were both Montrealers, and they both worked with us in that series of plays that we did at the Mountain Playhouse. And I can tell you a mischievous story about Bill Shatner. I know he won't mind. Will you, William? No. In those days, every young actor took as his model Marlon Brando. And that truthy, rather inarticulate, mumbly style of acting was very popular. Well, it so happened that we were doing a play called The Man Who Came to Dinner, which is about a crusty old curmudgeon. I had a big white beard and a lot of padding, and he was in a wheelchair because he'd broken his leg, and he was staying in this house with his family, and the son of the family was played by the then very young Bill Shatner. And he had some scenes with me in which he had to say various things to which I would respond with various so-called witticisms, get a few laughs, you see. But Bill, being a devotee, as he was, of Marlon Brando, would kind of slouch about and say his lines in a kind of mumbly, well, I don't know, sir. And so in order to make sure that the feed lines reached the audience, I would make him say them again. I'd say, "What's that you say, boy? Didn't hear you, son. Speak up now, I can't hear you." And I'd do all that stuff. And dear Bill remembers to this day, I know he does because we've laughed about it sometimes when we met, those adventures that we had when we were both of us a good deal younger. And now there he is, one of the products of our theatre in Canada, doing all kinds of magnificent things on the small screen. And I did one of them with him just last year, wasn't it? A thing called Tech War that he's now producing. Well, there you are. There's a lifetime. There's Bill's career, start to finish, in Canada.
Didn't you see the writing on the wall? Montreal was not the place to be.
Well, inevitably, although Montreal was indeed a very pleasant place to be, and although many of my wife's family lived there, my late mother-in-law lived there at that time, my wife's sister, Jennifer, lived in Montreal at that time, and my wife's brother, who's almost exactly the same age as me, and his wife, they all lived in Montreal, so there were great family ties, as it were, in Montreal. But it became evident quite soon that this town, Toronto, was going to really be the focal point of not only radio, but the upcoming television and the even more upcoming theatre, because of course all of this was before Stratford began. And so, sort of regretfully, we moved down here to Toronto I think I'm right to say somewhere at the end of 1952, just in time, in fact, for the birth of Canadian television, all of which, or most of which, grew out of those actors who had learned their trade, cut their teeth, if you like, in the various theatres in Canada, although many of them had not had very extensive theatre experience. But those early days of Canadian television, when we all used to foregather down there on Jarvis Street here in Toronto, were a marvellous, marvellous flowering of this new medium. Because, of course, all live, all in black and white, and the fact that it was all live led to all kinds of hilarious misadventures. We've all heard scores of stories how things went wrong. The first thing to go wrong on Canadian television was that on the opening day of the CBC's television station here in Toronto, the test pattern, which was to show that this was Channel 6, was put on upside down. That was the first thing the Canadian audience saw. It may have been something of a portent, I don't know.
Speaking of test patterns, you had a nickname. The Telegram had one?
Oh, yes, that's right. Talking of test patterns, in those early days, because I did so many different things for the CBC, I used to not only to play in all kinds of parts in all kinds of plays, but I also used to do sketches in musical reviews, musical numbers. Dear Jack Creeley and I became quite notorious as a kind of double act, singing some of those songs of Noel Coward's, mad dogs and Englishmen go out to the midday, all that stuff. And I was doing so many different kinds of things that some wag of a journalist who worked, I think, in those days for the now defunct newspaper called the Toronto Telegram, christened me the test pattern, because in those days the principal test pattern on the CBC was a profile drawing, I think it was, of a native Indian in a war bonnet with feathers. And this chap figured that since I did everything else for the CBC, he reckoned that might as well be me as well. So I became known as the test pattern. But the growth of the theatre was only just getting into full stride at this time. And of course, very soon you had in the inaugural Stratford Company, which I suppose most people would recognise was the real birth of the theatre in Canada, was the opening of the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in 1953, wasn't it? And in that company, I can remember many of them, were William Shatner, Lloyd Buckner, William Hutt, Don Harron, all kinds of guys, and ladies, of course not so many ladies in a Shakespeare company, although I mustn't forget, I've not named the wonderful Amelia Hall, who was a real pioneer of Canadian theatre because she had run a company of her own up in Ottawa. In the very earliest 50s. She also was in that inaugural Shakespeare Company. And of course, what a thrill it all was for those young Canadian artists to be playing in a company headed by Alec Guinness, no less, and directed by Tyrone Guthrie, no less. And I always remember coming away after the first night of the first season of that Shakespeare Festival in Stratford. I always remember saying to the friends I was with, and my wife who was with me, take a good look at this little town, because you'll never see it looking like this again. And miraculously, I was right. And I think to do the citizens of Stratford and the citizens of Niagara-on-the-Lake, where our other great festival, to do them all credit, I think that both of those towns would agree that at the end of the day, not only the whole country, but they, the citizens of Stratford and of Niagara-on-the-Lake, have, in the long run, immensely benefited by the ministrations of William Shakespeare and your friend and mine, George Bernard Shaw. Because, of course, Shakespeare was already very much a classic fixture in the theatres of the world in the 1950s. But George Bernard Shaw, not quite so much. A bit contentious, a bit controversial. People were not quite sure where to put him exactly. But by the time we got the Shaw Festival properly rolling, people were greeting his plays as if they'd been written yesterday morning. They were as modern as anything. And it's a great tribute to the far-sightedness of the Canadian audience that they've accepted the Shaw plays, which were much more difficult initially to digest, just as readily as they've accepted the great plays of Shakespeare. And they're now all universally recognized to be classics, by which we simply mean, of course, something that succeeding generations have agreed to enjoy and admire. That's what a classic is.
Now, you had more than just met Shaw.
Ah, yes. Now, talking of the great George Bernard Shaw, whom I'm sure you can see, is a great icon, hero of mine. Not only because I happen to think he's one of the great playwrights of the world, but because as an ignorant, stupid, mindless drama student at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, I had actually met the great George Bernard Shaw. It came about this way. George Bernard Shaw was on the Board of Governors of the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, where I was lucky enough to be studying. And as with everything else he did, he didn't just put his name to it, he put his heart in it and his shoulder behind it. And so whenever we were doing one of his plays, he would come along and take some rehearsals. And so we came to know him. Now, the extraordinary thing about this great man was his impeccable, his saintly courtesy to us snotty-nosed kids, didn't know our elbow from our other place. He would address us all as Mr. This and Miss That. And I vividly remember how when I was playing in a production of his play Androcles and the Lion, and I happened to be playing the lion, he came along to a rehearsal, and in his exquisitely cut tweed suit, he rolled on his back on our grubby rehearsal room floor in order to show me how the lion should behave when he wants his tummy tickled. Now, you've got to adore a man like that, haven't you? Such incredible, immediate, instinctive, total courtesy. And the more I've learned about Shaw, and in my life I've learned a great deal about Shaw, the more I realize that as well as being a great genius, he was that very rare combination of qualities, a great genius who was also a saintly human being. He liked, of course, to encourage the public persona of being a crusty, curmudgeonly old fellow who had no time for anything or anybody. That was merely his public persona. As he called it, the best of my inventions is the character known as GBS. In fact, in person, he was the most humane and modest and, as I say, saintly, compassionate human being I've ever met. And so it was fitting, I suppose, that when it came to 1966 and I was playing in a very popular television series in Hollywood, still popular, I'm glad to say, 30 years on, a series called The Fugitive, and I was in the middle of it all, and it was the most popular television series on earth. And Brian Doherty, who is a citizen of Niagara-on-the-Lake and who had founded the Shaw Festival there and piloted it for the first couple of years, came to me and said, would you be interested in coming to be our artistic director at Niagara-on-the-Lake to run the Shaw Festival? And I said, oh, Brian, I'm mixed up with chasing this guy in this television series back on the coast. But I said, you've asked the right guy at the right time, because I am a passionate devotee of George Bernard Shaw. I'll find out from my producers if I can get leave to absent myself long enough to do this. I went back to Hollywood to see my dear boss, no longer with us, alas, Quinn Martin, and I said, look, I've got this wonderful scheme that I want to work on in Canada. He said, what is it? He looked at me strangely as if I'd been smitten by some mysterious disease. I said, it's the Shaw Festival. There's going to be there is already a Shaw Festival in a place called Niagara-on-the-Lake, not Niagara Falls, down the road a little bit. And there we're going to do plays of George Bernard Shaw to draw an audience from all over the world. And they want me to be artistic director. Could I please? I had a contract, of course. Could I please have 3 months maybe to get all this started? Well, like a good friend, sympathizing with another friend whom he conceives as suffering from some strange malaise, he said, well, looks like you'd better, he said, thinking that he would humor me. And so I got this 3 months, and we settled down to put together this season, one of the most thrilling adventures of my life. It had been established, of course, the Shaw Festival, very bravely by the previous co-artistic directors, Andrew Allen, the great radio producer, as he had been at CBC, and his associate, Sean Mulcahy, who's still with us, I'm glad to say. And they had built up considerable interest in the Shaw Festival. But we wanted to go a lot further. We wanted to expand the length of the season. We wanted to do more ambitious productions. We were playing in this lovely little building, still there, considerably adapted now, of course, from those events of nearly 30 years ago, but we were playing in the town courthouse of Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I said, the first thing we must do is to make sure that we beat the drum, publicize all of this as widely as we can. And what we must do first is to warm up the town, because the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake at this point was by no means universally in support of this venture. They said to themselves, a lot of actors around here, drunken bums, won't pay their bills, we don't want them. A lot of people had that kind of view of it all. So we went around trying to warm up the town. But then, of course, we had to beat the drum, which was to make use of my notoriety. I made shameless use of the fact that I was on television every week to a larger audience than any other television show on earth. And I agreed to play in the first play and direct it. And in order to publicize ourselves as widely as we could, a friend of mine at the CBC said that they would do a piece for some television magazine show that was popular in those days. And they were going to bring a unit down, just as you brought your nice unit here in my apartment. They brought a unit down to Niagara-on-the-Lake, and they filmed our company in rehearsal, and they filmed the courthouse, and then the chap who was producing it, he said, we'll wind it all up with an interview with you in your office. Well, of course, I didn't have an office. The whole thing was totally poverty-stricken. We had all of us agreed, all that brave company of actors. This shows you how marvelously loyal actors are when they're met with a real challenge. All of that brave company of actors, some of them very well-known people, Leslie Yeoh, Tommy Kneebone, Betty Layton, I mustn't try and name them all because I'm bound to forget some. They had all agreed to work for a basic minimum salary, which was the same for everybody. And that was the spirit of that company in that season. And so to wind up this television magazine segment that we were filming, I said, yes, you can do an interview in my office. I didn't tell them I didn't have an office. So I said to my friend and helper, Raymond Wickens, my great company manager, and Lord High everything else, he and I did everything in that theatre, from running the rehearsals to cleaning the lavatories, literally. Raymond, I said, get me a couple of bent wood chairs from a kitchen or someplace, and a folding table. He said, why, what? I said, I'm going to do this interview. He said, well, where? I said, on the traffic island, in the middle of the road, right outside the courthouse. He said, wow, yes, okay. And he went and got these chairs and a folding table, and when they came to say, now we're going to shoot the interview in your office, I said, sure, come with me. We went out to alongside the clock tower there, many of you will remember it, in the middle of the main street in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and there we set down these two kitchen chairs and this small table, and I sat with this young man and did an interview just like I'm doing now, with all the cars going back and forth. We made a great point of the fact. He said, well, is this the best you can do by way of an office? I said, well, I keep typewriter under my bed, but you wouldn't want to see that. And so that dramatized the fact that we were doing all this for peanuts. And yet it got shown, that interview got shown not only all across Canada, but all across the US of A, with the result that by the time we got to our opening night, we were more than sold out for the whole season. That great season, I'm always proud to boast of this, although it was everybody's credit, the company and my young friend Raymond Wickens and all the rest of them who helped. That season, we played to 107% of capacity. Now, how can you manage 107%, I hear you cry? Well, the fact is that we used to have a few chairs round at the back, which the young people who were acting as ushers would smuggle in after the fire marshal had gone. Don't tell anybody. But it was all kinds of a record, and the most blissful memory on a personal level of that occasion was that by this time, 1966, my two children, Hayward and Melanie, our daughter, is 2 years older than Hayward, and they both at this time were studying at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, where I had studied as a boy. And their mother, my Sydney, was over there as den mother, taking care of them all. And they said, "Mother, you really ought to go to this opening of this Shaw Festival, because Daddy, you know, I feel terribly bereft if you weren't there." And she said, "Well, how can I?" They said, "Never mind." They managed to push their mother onto a plane the very day that we were opening the Shaw Festival season of 1966. And our festival was opening with a full-length production, including the Don Juan in Hell scene of Shaw's perhaps most profound play, Man and Superman. We were doing the whole shooting match, and I was playing the leading part and directing it and cleaning the lavatories and doing everything else that needed. I had no idea that Sydney was coming. So the first night came, and this whole long play, it plays nearly 5 hours, we went through, and it was triumphant, just triumphant. But I, as you can imagine, was not a little exhausted. So that when I came staggering off the stage at the end, into the arms of my colleagues and my friends, and we were swept into some kind of reception room where there was going to be a bit of a party, suddenly I saw my Sydney in a beautiful evening dress, and I thought, oh, this is what death is like. They've always told me that I'd kick off if I overdid it. I know I've been overdoing it. Well, if this is heaven, this is all right, I thought, because she had been put on this plane by our children. She had arrived here in Toronto. She had been driven down by some friend. Oh no, she came on a bus, I think. She went on a bus as far as St. Catharines and changed in the ladies' room in the bus station at St. Catharines, and then was driven by another friend from St. Catharines down to the theatre. She'd arrived just in time for the beginning of the play, and there she was in a beautiful evening dress. And I thought, well, there we are. I may have died, but I've certainly gone to heaven. And that was the greatest theatrical first night of my whole life. And now that theatre has 3 different theatres of its own, and is thriving better than it ever has. All on the basis of that great man, George Bernard Shaw. Wonderful to think of, wonderful to think of.
Were there any